hello everybody, and hello folks in television YouTube land. It's nice to see everybody. First of all, I was surprised and delighted and a little awestruck when Laura asked me if I would lead the Defense of the Faith Committee, and I said yes because there's a committee. So I want to take a moment to thank Brett Mitchell and Irina Grossu and Charles McLaughlin and Mary Petrino and Marlana Oettinger and Jeff Cooper and Christian Simper for being on the committee. What we're looking at doing for the next couple of years actually is a series on the Catholic worldview, since it seems to be being battered about, and we don't really have a clear grasp all the time of what is a Catholic worldview. And we will have more details on what that will look like in the Defense of the Faith meeting in January. But for the time being, I'm delighted and honored that my friend Andrea Picciotti-Bayer has agreed to speak with us this evening. In a way, it's kind of the preface to the next 2 years. In a way, she's setting the stage for us. Andrea is the director of the Conscience Project, which is a religious freedom and conscious rights advocacy and public education organization. It's a long and packed sentence that means she fights for the rights of believers and of the church. She's a Stanford-educated lawyer. She launched a career in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, specializing in institutional reform and appellate litigation. Andrea is a legal analyst for EWTN News and the National Catholic Register, focusing primarily on religious freedom matters before the Supreme Court. She's also written for the Washington Post, Newsweek, SCOTUSblog, the New York Post, National Review, RealClear, the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, Public Discourse, Spectator World, and Crux, and is the host of the National Catholic Register's Religious Freedom Matters podcast. She lived in Colombia for over a decade. She has 10 children, one of whom is my godson, one of my godchildren. And she lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So Andrea, I asked Andrea, because she works in the area of conscience, if she would actually speak to us about the challenges we are now facing in maintaining Catholic identity and witness in the current environment, and ways that we can work to protect the rights of the church and all believers, whether they're Catholic or not. We'll have questions and answers following the presentation. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest and my dear friend, Andrea.
So I just want to say, if David Carradini ever calls, I would never refuse any request from David or from Rose. You guys have a gem, a treasure, and I'm sure everyone knows that in their family. And he's been a friend for over 20 years and provided just incredible friendship and good counsel. So if you ever got a problem, talk to David. So I wanted to start off, I kind of think it's important to set the stage, just like David said. Our society is becoming ever more contemptuous of religious belief, and Catholics are under pressure not to let their faith go beyond the parish parking lot. At the same time, however, some of our political leaders constantly refer to themselves as Catholic, even while they promote policies that are at odds with church teaching, natural law, and the common good. The most shocking example, of course, is militant support for abortion among some of our politicians. So my hope for our conversation this evening is to discuss 3 considerations. The first is the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal, between heaven and earth. The second is how the U.S. Constitution regards the relationship between church and state, between believers and the government. And finally, how in light of these 2 considerations, Christians, Catholics can continue to offer that Christian difference in society. So first, what's the relationship between the church and the Christian in society? This has always been a tricky question. From the very beginning of the Christian faith, followers of Jesus have been struggling with the relationship between the 2 worlds in which they're tied, the temporal, and the heavenly. Professor Russell Hittinger, a senior fellow at Catholic University's Institute for Human Ecology, gave a talk recently asserting that the proper term for the relationship between the heavenly state and the temporal state is separated. They are set apart. And this setting apart, he explained, was done by Jesus when he declared in John 18, verse 36, that my kingdom is not of this world. 3 times in Professor Hittinger's talk, he stopped to say that this is tough teaching. Even the disciples rejected it, sometimes vehemently, Peter especially. That's why Jesus admonishes him in the garden when he pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of the retainer. Peter was not yet confirmed in the faith, and he thought that that way to Christ is through combat. So Jesus healed the ear and put it back on the soldier. And I didn't know this until recently. The soldier's name was Malchus. I'm looking at Father to double check. And which means king in Greek. So Jesus affirmed a rule here below, and Peter later understood. According to Hittinger, Christians should engage with civil society as Christians, bringing their deepest beliefs into the public square. But, and this is such a crucial point, our civic engagement should not attempt to subjugate civil society to the authority of the church, because to do so would humiliate the church. So let me quote from St. John Paul II in a passage that was highlighted by Professor Scott Roniger from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles in support of Hittinger's thesis. That great saint and pope, in his aptly titled reflection, Sign of Contradiction, described the difference between our current economic and political life on the one hand and Christian life on the other hand in the following way, and I quote, it's very long. Man cannot remain oblivious of the great threat posed by the veritable imperialisms which vie endlessly with one another, but which cannot ultimately claim to have at heart the good of the real happiness of mankind. Indeed, the reverse is true. For these powers, those imperialisms, see in man's freedom and inner truth, the biggest of all threats to themselves. The coming of Jesus of Nazareth into the world, the incarnation of the Word, is the revelation of a completely different economy. Present-day political economy has fully mastered the techniques of buttressing the power of this world. By contrast, Christ could say in all truth, not just once before Pilate, but again before every power or political system in existence today, my kingdom is not of this world, end quote. So politics is necessary, an inevitable part of our lives, but its ambitions should not be confused with the kingdom. At the same time, the principle of separation mustn't lead to indifference. Pope Benedict articulated this beautifully. He said, quote, it is by pursuing her own finality that the church sheds the light of the gospel on earthly realities in order that human beings may be healed of their miseries and raised in dignity. The Second Vatican Council, at which Benedict was a major advisor, perhaps one of the few still alive, grasped this relationship between the temporal and the spiritual worlds in its declaration on religious freedom. Dignitatis Humanae explains that all men and women instinctively seek the truth, which is revealed in its fullness in the teachings of God's Holy Catholic Church, adding that, quote, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. The declaration also points to the Church's mission of evangelization, explaining that for the Church to fulfill her divine mission, which is of course the salvation of souls, religious freedom must not only be proclaimed in word and incorporated into law, but also must be given sincere and practical application. So here we have a distinction that some Catholics still don't seem to understand. Let me repeat these words. The truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. That means that the triumph of the gospel is not a victory that is won by imposing political dominion or domination over others. It's with this understanding that I now turn to how our constitutional order sets up the fertile ground for the church and for individual believers. So what is the relationship between the church and state, believers and the government under the US Constitution? Well, the First Amendment contains 2 clauses relating to religious freedom. The first, the Establishment Clause, says that the government cannot interfere in religious matters. It's not quite the same thing as the Second Vatican Council's insistence about the truth not being imposed, but it's entirely consistent with it. The Free Exercise Clause, meanwhile, protects our right as believers to worship and to behave in ways that are consistent with our beliefs. Again, it seems to anticipate the Council, which calls for the sincere and practical application of laws protecting religious freedom. The First Amendment's religious clauses not only give Catholics the right to practice our faith, but also create the space in which we can evangelize, freed from government coercion. And as the Supreme Court explained in a decision just this past summer, contrary to prior understanding, these 2 clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, are not in tension, but they work in tandem to protect religious liberty. We also need to note now more than ever that the First Amendment's protection of free speech is a crucial safeguard when the government tries to impose ideological conformity on Catholics in an attempt to force them to ignore the most sacred church teachings. A look at recent cases shows that when religious exercise, conscience rights, and religious expression are suppressed, and they are being suppressed, the church's ability to serve and evangelize is damaged. Remember the Little Sisters of the Poor? They're still fighting the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. Despite the government's repeated losses in the Supreme Court, some federal officials still want to force these nuns to include abortion pills in their employee insurance plan. Meanwhile, Catholic doctors, nurses, hospitals, and associations worry that these same officials, dead set on enforcing the ideology of gender identity, will require them to perform or pay for gender reassignment therapies and procedures. That's why our constitutional freedoms matter so much. The First Amendment's protection of religious liberty may be the only way to prevent the government from shutting the doors of these hospitals and forcing doctors and nurses to violate their consciences. Fortunately, this Supreme Court has been very protective of the First Amendment, particularly in cases involving church autonomy and religious believers. For example, the court recently recognized the ministerial exception, which frees churches from government oversight related to personnel decisions for ministers. What's more, the court embraced a broad definition of who qualifies as a minister, ruling that the exception applied to religion teachers in parochial schools. Needless to say, the progressive lobby, backed by unimaginable sums of money, doesn't want parochial schools to enjoy this constitutional freedom, so we can expect more legal challenges to employment decisions, those particularly involving people living publicly in same-sex marriages, as well as those embracing a gender identity different from their biological sex. Another issue is the attempt to exclude Catholic social service organizations that refuse to embrace the ideas contrary to the faith. 2 terms ago, the Supreme Court unanimously confirmed the Archdiocese of Philadelphia's right to provide foster care service and support for children without having to reject church teaching on the nature of traditional marriage. It was an important victory, but many questions were left unanswered. Specifically, Does the Constitution protect religious exercise when it conflicts with neutral anti-discrimination laws? And then there's the question of the Constitution's protection for religious speech. The Supreme Court has very clearly defended that freedom. We saw that this past summer when the court vindicated the First Amendment right of Joseph Kennedy, a public high school coach in Washington State, to pray in Thanksgiving after games. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the court's majority, observed that, quote, respect for religious expressions is indispensable to life in a free and diverse republic. So in other words, a live and let live approach under the law creates the space for other people of faith to live consistent with their beliefs, and this bodes well for the petitioner in another religious expression case the Supreme Court will decide this term. On December 5th, the Supreme Court will hold oral argument in 303 Creative versus Alenis. It's a case brought by Lori Smith, a Christian website designer in Colorado, who wants to expand her business to create custom wedding websites. I had not known that there is a thing called a custom wedding website, but apparently that's a thing. So Smith is an experienced marketing and design professional, and after working for several years in the industry, she decided to go out on her own and start 303 Creative. Named after the area code in Denver, where her company's based, Smith creates website designs for anyone, but she doesn't create all messages. So you can probably guess why this is relevant. Smith does not want to be forced to create wedding websites for same-sex weddings. And before expanding her business to include wedding website design services, she filed what was called a pre-enforcement challenge in federal court to Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act, also known as CADA. And CADA bars businesses that are open to the public from discriminating against people based on sexual orientation or announcing an intent to do so. You might remember CADA from another case that was decided by the court a number of years ago involving a Colorado baker, Christian baker called Jack Phillips. Yep. In that case, the court ruled in favor of Jack Phillips based on the overwhelming hostility that the state's Civil Rights Commission showed him, but they didn't get to the issue that Lori Smith's case is going to be reaching, which is the constitutionality of CADA itself. Now, while Smith claimed that the right to the free exercise of religion is threatened by CADA, by its application, the court's review is limited to her free speech claim. So Smith's attorneys, who are obliged to respect the court's decision, argued in papers filed with the court the lower court's decision will force Smith to speak, to use her expressive talents against her conscience. And such compelled speech, they assert, has consistently been condemned by the Supreme Court as violating the First Amendment. The cases they cite, again, are probably familiar to you. They include decisions invalidating enforcement of public accommodations laws that include sexual orientation against the organizers of Boston's St. Patrick's Day Parade and against the Boy Scouts of America. If the lower decision court stands, Smith would be forced to personally design and actively create a website and publish it on the internet. Just think what a sinister precedent that would create. So a robust protection of religious freedom has been good for the church in allowing believers and the church to serve others without having to abandon belief. And let's note that the very act of defending religious freedom offers a chance to evangelize, to explain the church's teaching, and why, as Catholics, we believe that its principles, while increasingly unpopular, advance the common good. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage people to pick up Helen Alvarez's latest book. It really goes to this issue about when we defend religious freedom, it's kind of our opportunity to take a second bite at the apple and explain why we believe that the church's teachings are true and good for society. So this leads me to my third point in our talk. How should Catholics and other Christians respond to the new and troubling challenges we face? So, results from the midterm elections have several states now providing legal safe haven for the gruesome act of abortion. And the response of Catholics and other pro-life Americans can't be despair or despondency. Instead, we can draw on 2,000-year tradition of mobilizing as a community of believers, uniting the church and our country. So let me tell you how my 6-year-old son, the youngest of the 10, of all people, is helping to clarify my thoughts on this. With his first grade classmates, he's memorizing a biblical passage that offers good counsel. Joshua 1, 6 through 9, be strong and courageous. I hear in the minivan on the way to school and back. It's simple, but incredibly powerful words that give us insight. Many of our public servants already are showing strong models of strength and courage. Take, for example, those Supreme Court justices who voted in the majority to overturn Roe v. Wade this past summer. They face grotesque pro-abortion protests in front of their houses weekly. One of them, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, was also targeted recently by an online open letter which asks Penguin Random House to take back its offer to publish a book that she's writing. And yet, they continue in their work undeterred. Only be strong and very courageous, my child reminds me as he recites Joshua 1, verse 7. Big abortion isn't the only bully public servants and private citizens face. Gender ideologues within our own government pressure Catholic hospitals and medical professionals to perform reassignment surgeries and hormonal therapies despite their objections on medical and conscience grounds. These and other ideological demands of many progressive groups are increasingly backed by the government. Take, for example, Lori Smith. She faces the prospect of being forced to use her talents in ways that conflict with her beliefs. Now, practicing Catholics and other Christians should be ready to reject progressivism's turn to the left. We don't embrace the push for unrestricted abortion. We don't embrace gender ideology's rejection of nature. We defend rights of conscience. But what about the temptation to turn to the right? That passage from Joshua cautions, be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. We must also be on guard from problematic proposals from certain movements on the right to dismantle our existing government only to replace it with one that brazenly extends power and control over others. So where does this leave us? Well, we have a lot of thinking to do. But extremes imposed by intellectual elites on the left or on the right on the American people are not the answer. Rather, Catholics and other people of goodwill must continue to play the long game. It's one that's been passed on to us for generations. We participate as citizens consistent with our faith. We advance policies that promote the common goods of the church and of society. We're patient and kind, even on social media. Super hard for me. We respect the freedom God has given to each and every person to know, love, and serve Him, and are committed to doing the hard work of making sure to share the good news about Him. This approach won't make headlines. It does nothing to prevent us from being maligned, but sweet consolation is found in verse 9 of Joshua 1. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Thank you very much for having me.
Questions or comments?
This is probably really unfair to ask you this. It's an issue that I've had trouble with all my adult life, and I've talked to many priests. And the only ones that have given me hope are the young ones that are, you know, relatively young priests. Speaking of conscience, how does the church justify giving communion to pro-choice people? Obviously, politicians are the first one to come to mind. Someone told me the other day, I spent my whole career just about on the Hill, that Nancy Pelosi wants to represent the Vatican. Asked her to do that. And everything says to me, there's no way that that would happen, but I really fear it might. And am I the only person that has trouble with the church speaking pro-life, but not separating those who believe contrary to the Catholic faith? I just don't understand that. Have you ever?
Yeah, no, I think I was very impressed on the issue of the pastoral care that Archbishop Cordileone in San Francisco gave. And I think that that's a perfect model for our bishops, because their relationship is different than the relationship that we have. We have a fraternal relationship with people, and there's a lot that we can do, you know, in as far as fraternal correction. But that example, and kind of laying out that there was a consistent outreach out of love, because we all know that correction is an act of charity, right? It's super hard, right? But it is an act of charity. The challenge in all of these right now is the confusion. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about what I called counterfeit Catholicism, and it's very confusing, not only for society to see people holding themselves out as Catholic and presenting, you know, policies, especially if they're in positions of authority that go contrary to church teaching, but it's really hard for the church, and it really creates a space in which there's that lack of coherence, right? Because people will say, you know, if so-and-so is getting a pass here, well then I can fudge on whether I'm coherent. And we need to model in our own lives coherence, right? I think it's something that I remember once talking to Father Jacques Philippe. He was visiting a number of years ago, and I was presenting some very difficult, complicated thing, and he looks at me, tiny little Belgian beard, and he said, "That's crazy. You need to pray more." I was like, there you have it. So I think, you know, there are certain things that are beyond what we as individuals have the authority to accomplish, but none of that limits our ability to pray, because what we do want is we want salvation of all souls, right? We want people who are living in a state of incoherence or not complying with the teachings that they know as baptized Catholics or as confirmed Catholics. We want them to come to plenitude of truth in their own lives, and we want them to be witness. And I think we need to hold up and point to members of our hierarchy that are really doing that in exemplary fashion. You know, they're leading with an abundance of love. We need to pray for them. I don't think it's easy, and there's so many pressures on. If we feel the pressures, can you imagine the pressures that they're feeling? But I would really read that letter, maybe bring it to your own personal prayer, and we pray for our elected officials.
Yes.
We need to continue to do that, and we need to do it earnestly, because I find myself being like, yeah, right, you know? And really earnestly do it, because our country needs leaders, right? I was at a talk last week, and it was the Religious Freedom Institute, which is a wonderful organization, and there was a man that was introducing the awardee, and he gave a perfect image. He said, you know, if you're in a house that has a light and it's dark outside, and you open up the door to the outside, the darkness doesn't come in, the light goes out. And the church in general, but the church especially in America right now, is a house that has a light burning for it, and what we need to really do is kind of up our game again on evangelizing with incredible charity and compassion, because we're dealing especially on issues of life. There's generations that thought that abortion was a good, and we need to be there for them as they come back to understanding what the common good really is. She's like the smart one in the room.
So no, one of the things that someone brought up that was a really good point was that because right now we're in an awkward place with Catholic healthcare, where we are losing Catholic identity in hospitals, and it's very sad, and so the ones that are actually living by Catholic identity, you know, we just have to become aware of which ones they are, and even do audits to see which Catholic hospitals are actually practicing according to Catholic ethics. But one of the things that's going to hurt our conscience arguments are when we make claims that we want our consciences protected, but then when our healthcare systems aren't living and practicing according to Catholic ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to make that case in law, when in reality, it can be proven that some of these hospitals are not actually practicing their Catholic ethics, if you can comment on that.
You know, it goes back again to the incoherency, right? We need to hold up our healthcare institutions, organizations. There are a number that are in active litigation right now that are standing for not only, you know, the truth about the human person as we understand as Catholics, but just basic medical ethics, because a lot of these procedures are against, you know, just basic medical ethics. It's not even an issue that needs the light of church teaching. You don't operate on healthy organs. You know, you don't remove them, right? And so those organizations need to be pointed to as models. I think in many contexts, hospital administrators think that they have to bend, especially when many of our Catholic hospital institutions, especially in rural communities, are the only institutions serving those communities. And so if they are forced to close, there's a big danger, and that it's a serious concern that there's going to be a community that goes without any kind of medical care. We need to point to the fact that you've got the law on your side. You've got plenty of really incredible lawyers that are going to represent you. I mean, I am a big fan of Beckett Law, that is, you know, just every time they go to the Supreme Court, they win. Just every time. You know, and the Alliance Defending Freedom is another group that is taking on these cases. Thomas More Society as well. We need to encourage people to contribute, to donate to those defense organizations in these contexts. But I think that if hospital, especially these big hospital entities, know that you don't have to water down your mission in order to serve, you know, you don't have to. Maybe they're gonna have some more courage. And I do think that that's also a place where Catholic journalism has been very, very important. There was a situation of teaching going on at Georgetown Medical School, and it's really important that we put pressure on groups to say, you know, Catholic healthcare can be consistent, must be consistent with church teaching, and not to shame them, but to encourage them to kind of redirect their course, only because, you know, we don't want to have institutions that are Catholic in name only. And I think that that's the challenge right now, is people, especially running these groups, think that they have to bend in order to serve. And when we do that, we're not serving the way that God's asked us to.
Yeah, I would apply that to the universities as well.
Mm-hmm.
But on a different note, as a government employee, more and more people are putting their pronouns behind their names, and I won't do it. And there's just a mounting pressure, which is just, you know, an insidious, that you buy into this whole idea that I have to announce whether or not, you know, what my gender is. And it's just, and so I'm guessing at some point it's going to be required that you put your pronouns on your name. And I'm just, you know, I'm just anticipating, you know, that I'm hoping that at some point, you know, we as Catholics and Christians will be able to stand up and say, no, we're not doing it, and we may end up in front of the Supreme Court to be battling for our jobs potentially.
Well, and it's very interesting. There have been a couple cases on this, especially in public universities, which you mentioned in the beginning, that there have been some Christian, you know, God bless the evangelicals in this, because they're oftentimes leading the charge. And a professor, I think it was in Georgia, Gwinnett College, no, a different college, where he refused to identify a student by a pronoun that was different than the student's biological sex on the basis of his personal convictions. He would, you know, refer to the person by their name, but wasn't going to fall into that, and he was punished, and you know, filed suit and won eventually, and his legal fees and all those, you know, damages were issued against the university, because the university was, of course, acting as a government entity. I think that goes back to what I mentioned before, this notion of compelled speech. It used to be, I remember when I was in college, such a long time ago, that we studied the famous case of the Nazis marching on Skokie. And if anyone knows anything about the Chicago area from the Midwest, Michigan, and Skokie at the time had one of the largest concentrations of Holocaust survivors. And neo-Nazi group wanted to march in Skokie, right? Horrible. And the ACLU defended their right to march in Skokie. And it was one of those situations where if you don't defend and enforce freedom of speech for even the most disgusting expression, we're going to lose it entirely. And not to say that like rejecting pronouns is disgusting. I think it's unpopular, right? It's incredibly popular to play into this notion of identity politics. And this is where we need to tap into what I like to call old school civil rights. I'm saddened and disappointed that the ACLU is now on the other side of the V in these cases and not defending freedom of speech, and instead promoting a progressive agenda that really does use the strength and the authority of the government to silence people, or worse yet, to put words into people's mouths. That's not consistent with our first freedoms. It doesn't mean that we're not going to face an uphill battle, but our law and our tradition are on the side of defending our rights to protect what we want to say and not be forced to say something against our beliefs.
So, this is all wonderful and great discussion. One of the things experience, given your public stances, is the rapidity and the ferocity with which those who oppose our ideas and our faith rely upon ad hominem attacks. And how quickly someone is the idea that you can't even make the case because you're this or you're that, so you have no, in essence, to use a legal term, you have no standing. How are you finding people being successful in repelling the ad hominems and getting into the substance of the issues?
You know, it's interesting that you say that because the ad hominem attacks aren't exclusively used by the progressive left. We find even within people who share a common understanding resorting to this kind of race to the bottom, right? And it's incredibly disappointing that people are talking past each other. And now is not the time to talk past each other. I find that this is something that Father Aquinas Gilbo, who's the new chaplain at Catholic University at Dominican, amazing, said once in conversations. In our tradition, the scholastic tradition especially, we have to reflect a desire for the good of the other. And ad hominem attacks don't allow for that. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to truly want the good of the other and continuing to respond, looking for what's the need behind whatever crazy argument. Oftentimes it's from a place of ignorance or a place of woundedness. And when we respond in a genuine, sincere desire to try to understand what's the need that you're trying to satisfy with this, you know, gender ideology is a perfect example, right? I don't know if, I have middle school girls, hot mess. They're a hot mess. And when we see that oftentimes, especially with young people who are claiming, an identity different than their biological sex, it's because profound insecurity and just normal growth and walking with people in that tough time is probably the greatest contribution. It's most effective when it's done one-on-one. And that's where these platforms in which we're distanced from one another, especially social media platforms, don't lend itself to really caring for a person directly, right? There's this great abyss in which people can kind of be nasty, and you're like, I can't imagine that you're that nasty in person. So my recommendation is respond with an abundance of good. In many of these cases, there's a huge amount of spiritual warfare going on. And we have to be very mindful of that and bring things to prayer. A friend of mine who's now on the Court of Appeals, as a judge, he was a big advocate in religious freedom. He was dealing with some of the first bathroom cases. And he said before he sat down to do any of his work, write any of the briefs, he would pray, because he knew that this is something profoundly demonic, and his adversary wasn't his enemy. We know who the enemy is. His adversary, was making arguments, but it was from a place of confusion, ignorance, and disorientation, and really wanting that person's good. So I think, if you haven't picked up a book, Father Ripperger's, deliverance prayers, I got that in my purse, So.
Well, just to jump on that, there's the St. Michael's Center in
Yeah.
DC.
Yeah.
Monsignor Rossetti does these now,
Monthly.
Yeah, he'll do an online
so
monthly
it's a
deliverance
great
prayer.
education piece, and I think that is the heart of the issue of
Yes.
all that we're talking
Yeah.
about now, is truth.
I think to further your point and what you just said, unfortunately, politics has become their religion.
Yes.
They don't have
Yes.
religion anymore, whatever that may be, whether it's Catholic or whatever you, and have you. And so when you try to make an argument with them or what have you, it's like you're questioning my religiosity or whatever you wanna call it. And I think, and it's so hard, as you pointed out, like, I say to myself, like, I was driving over here tonight, and I heard that the Senate passed this marriage thing, 62 to 37. I'm totally against that. I'm sure everybody in this room is. And then I said to myself, what am I gonna get mad at all those people that voted for it? No, I'm gonna just, as you said, pray for them. And I think if we, and it is hard, but if we show that we're not trying to demean anybody, that we're trying to, and we're not trying to say we are holier than thou by staying with our beliefs, that we really care about them and give a true meaning of why the peace that we have, and maybe we can show it to them that maybe someplace down the road this crazy ideology and this hate and so forth will disdain. So I think it's important to always put forth the good, not to cast judgment. He was about to sit on cast the first stone. I think we just have to work and pray about how we can get through that. And it isn't easy.
No, and Archbishop Gomez, if you haven't read it was a speech that he gave, gosh, maybe a year and a half ago in Madrid, and it was talking about pseudo-religions, these ideologies. And again, he is a churchman with a big heart, and not just for people within the church, but for all people, and knowing that this is very difficult, but I keep thinking, like, God made us for these times. Like, great, no pressure, but he chose us, and we are called to live his witness. I think a lot about, especially what happened after the Dobbs case this past summer. It was an important victory to take down a legal barrier to helping to promote a culture of life, right? Roe and Casey created hurdles that made it very, very difficult to promote a culture of life. That barrier is down. That's not the end of the story, right? And when we think about some of the most powerful stories are the sidewalk counselor. And I don't know if any of you, I pass in Falls Church. There's a abortion center near where my older children go to school, and I see people out there, and they're tirelessly, and they show an abundance of love. And you can see the power of their prayer transforming the culture. And especially when we're dealing with women who are facing challenges and they don't have the natural supports that they need to be able to carry their child, that's where we step in as the church. We can adopt them, both in, giving the supports that they need, physical, material supports, because that's necessary, but praying for them and just, like rooting for them. We really need to want their good. I'm sure you've all heard, like, I want to get to heaven and bring as many people with me as possible. Like, that should be our sporting spirit here. It's not to just take care of our own or just take care of my people. And be very attentive, because the culture is so toxic right now, even within our own families. And especially within our own families, because the enemy hates family.
One other
Yeah.
question, how do you do this with 10 children?
I'm like, I turned the phone off to make sure that, like, there's like fire in my house right now. No, I think, God gives each one of us incredible blessings, and there, family it's not without its wrinkles and challenges. I've been very fortunate And I've also been very fortunate because of a community of faith around me and my family. And that's where, as we get older, think about what you can do, especially for young families right now, especially if they're thinking about, we can't afford a Catholic education. Maybe that's something that you can say, here is a scholarship for your child, because we know that our education system, public education system in particular, is very, very harmful. And if, until the time comes where school choice can be a government program, we personally can make school choice possible. And I know that my folks help me out with kids, and I've had friends help out. It's a great opportunity to be able to take what resources we have and invest in the next generation, because we're investing in the church.
Thank you.
I was like, oh goodness. Father was gonna ask one more thing. Please.
I'm not gonna stop the applause, my goodness. It's a bit of an odd thought, but it's connected to this line of discussion with regards to the fact that a lot of this is taking place in the context of spiritual warfare, and that what we're doing is trying to carve out a space where it's possible to undertake effective evangelization with courage, with confidence, with hope. And one of the things that always fascinated me, and also on the subject of supporting those who are really trying to live out their vocations, specifically in family life in this case. But one of the things that's always struck me about the history of the church in this moment when the world became Christian, at least the European world became Christian after the days of Roman paganism, is the ancient Christians were absolutely convinced that their evangelical efforts and the conversions of conversion of peoples was entirely due to the fact that they had on their side legions of consecrated people, legions of people whose lives were entirely given over to God and to God only. And you see this in kind of the logic of how they would go about evangelization, how they would talk about spreading the faith, is you would see this sense of spiritual combat, of tearing down pagan temples, of exercising the land, of consecrating territory, even to Almighty God, that was really, in their mind, connected to the spiritual power of the monasteries and the convents. And I think this is just a really odd point to make. But while we're talking about the sort of things that we can promote, places that we want to invest in, if we're going to invest in the church, certainly in Catholic education, certainly in the health of young families, certainly in the active religious life, religious orders that are out in the world, certainly in diocesan priesthood. But one place that we always forget, and we're kind of, we have a blind spot to it in the U.S., just because it's not a part of our history, in the same way as the monastic life, is we are desperately short of cloistered people. We're desperately short of them. In a way that we're, people talk about priesthood, diocesan, a crisis of diocesan vocations, or a crisis of, religious sisters teaching in schools, and both of those things are maybe true, probably not. I would debate both of those points vigorously. But I think what we do have a real lack of are people who have the courage to say, my entire life is to be spiritual artillery. Because one of the things that we also find, and you can talk to Father Luke Clark or Father Rossetti or Father Ripperger on that subject as well, is the efficacy of our prayer, the efficacy of our exorcistic work of evangelization, the efficacy of our evangelization itself, is tied to the health of the church. Because the church is only one body, and if the church is healthy, our evangelization goes farther. And if the church is not healthy, no matter our kind of personal holiness, there's something that we're working against. And so I would encourage anyone who's involved in talking to young people, encouraging vocations, anything in that world, not to forget the cloistered life, because a good monk or a good nun hidden away from the world makes the work that we do far more effective than we realize. I think if we're fighting without the spiritual artillery, left field point, a bit strange, and a bit, not in line with the rest of the conversation.
No, no, no.
But all that to say, don't forget the monks, we need them desperately. It's very much a part of this seeing the conversation and seeing those lines of combat in spiritual terms that affect our natural ability to communicate with one another. So,
That's a great segue to encourage everybody to come to the retreat. And for those who want it, there is going to be a wing that is just for silence for the whole retreat for those who want it. So that if you want to taste silence, you want to understand something of their life, you have the chance. And it'd just be super if we could fill that. And one of the things we've been speaking about is having a nocturnal adoration from Compline on the first night through morning prayer the next night. And I think it just would be great if we were there in numbers. There was no extra places, and we were praying and singing and really listening to what our priests and what our speakers are going to be sharing with us.
I just wanted to reassure that there are a number of knights and doms in this region who are very supportive of the Linden Dominicans.
Good.
And just a plug, this year it's no accident that Latare Sunday falls on March 19th, superseding the feast, the great feast of Saint Joseph, our noble patron. But we'll all be there as an order, I hope, on Latare Sunday to support the Linden Dominicans, because last year we had 2 tables, thanks be to God. So we never forget. And nor do we forget the poor Clares.
Yeah.
So they are yes, they're the artillery for sure. But likewise, even Mother Teresa's active order, which we support with our work on a weekly basis out of this region, we've seen the spiritual warfare go on over there big time, and it always goes so much better when we really pray before we serve. There's a lot to be said for that.
Well, thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was beautiful. It's always good to get like a little pep talk and feel like, right, we're supposed to find the good. Because I was just having a talk the other day with a friend of mine that she was very discouraged. I'm like, no, really? There is so much good going on in the world. We just don't hear it. So our job is to like hear it and amplify it and spread it, because it's so empowering to know that the Holy Spirit is so active, working day and night. And when we listen, it's unbelievable. And how much more can we do together? Thank you so much for all your words of inspiration and what you said, finding the good in everything and everyone. And that is going to help us to be who we were meant to be. And when we are who we're meant to be, we're gonna set the world on fire. Catherine of Siena.
I've never seen that before.
I know. And Saint Joan of Arc. We were made for a time such as this, as you said. And it's so true. And it is actually very exciting in the midst of all the depressing news and everything else. Like, we were created for this time. Go set the world on fire. Yes. Okay.